Ann Neumann. She is a journalist and a Pulitzer Center grantee. She has written a piece in Harper's magazine in the January issue, I think it is, of Harper's magazine, um, on the war in Ethiopia and its crime against civilians. And I guess Ann, welcome to the program. And I guess the sort of the central thesis of your piece is that there has been crimes against civilians that the war has brought about, that it is hard to really say that it's been exclusively one side or the other in this conflict.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge of the war, beyond the fact that its context is complicated and it's impossible to get to the territory where the war is actually taking place. The challenge was how then to write about the atrocities that this war brought about for Ethiopian people. And we'll get into the logistics, I assume, but that northern state of Tigray, which has been cut off from the rest of the country and was besieged by the federal troops, was impossible to get to. Any reporters there, local journalists or international journalists, were detained or booted out of the country. And this had gone on for a period of time. And I decided that it was still worthwhile to go and talk to refugees if I could find them, to talk to Tigrayans throughout the country who were also experiencing harassment, and to see what was taking place in the country itself. Because even though the federal troops were portraying themselves as the good guys, even though I could only be in safer territory, there was still a lot of violence that had taken place. And I just want to say it's the February issue of
apologies.
Harper's. Not
Apologies.
at all. So yes, a lot of violence. And I just wanted to, because no one else was writing about it, I wanted to see what I could do.
You know, I have to say, this is the second interview I've done in this conflict. And I held off for a long time because of more or less what you're expressing. I just had no sense. And there is such a concerted effort, it seems like, by both parties to claim that the other is engaged in a successful propaganda program, that it becomes really hard to assess from this distance. And I guess it was with mixed emotions I had that you found it hard to assess on some level, even from that close proximity. From sitting here in Brooklyn, it seems virtually impossible. But will you just give us, we've gone through this a little bit, but I'd like to refresh people's memories. Give us a little bit of the context for this conflict, because for years, when you talked about conflict in Ethiopia, it was with Eritrea. And almost what feels like in just a short period of time, that sort of reversed.
Right. Yeah. And Alex DeWall, I believe, was your prior guest. Is
Yes.
that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. He's fantastic, really knows his stuff, but also on social media and elsewhere has been undermined and called horrible names and deeply criticized. It's a deeply polarizing situation. I'll start with 2018. There were riots taking place all over Ethiopia, and the sitting then president decided to abdicate his role, and the ruling party, which is a coalition of various groups, the EPRDF, went through the process of trying to find a new leader, and they landed on Abiy Ahmed. And of course, in Ethiopia, we use the first names. And Abiy was half Oromo, half Amhara, and young, has a PhD, very appealing. And he seemed like the right person. He came to power, and the West loved him. He had a huge movement and support base in Ethiopia. He very quickly went to Eritrea, one of the most authoritarian nations on the continent, but certainly in the world, and made peace with Isaias Afwerki, who has been the leader there since 1991. And we can go back and track some of that interesting history at some point. And for that peace, Abiy won the Nobel Peace Prize, and things were looking up and up. He had a lot of great language around him, talk of unity and democracy, and he comes from a prosperity gospel type background, and really wanted Ethiopia to develop. But it seems now that that peace deal also involves some conversation of how to get rid of both Abiy's enemy as far as power goes, and Eritrea, Isaias Afwerki's old enemy, the TPLF, or the Tigray People's Liberation Front. And that TPLF leadership, after they lost power, retreated to their home state of Tigray, which is in the north of Ethiopia. It's right against the Eritrean border. And in fact, some of the bad blood between the Tigrayans and the Eritreans dates to 2007 and 2008, and a border dispute there. There are other complications, of course, but so here is Abiy, new president of Ethiopia, making this peace deal that also says we're going to get rid of our mutual enemy, the Tigrayans. And there were a lot of other hostilities. I think both sides are still are pointing fingers at each other, and we're still not clear on when the first moves of the war were. Although the TPLF has said that they acted preemptively by attacking federal bases in the Tigray state. That was on November 3rd, 2020. And immediately, the federal government, under Abiy's direction, closed off Tigray. They stopped everything at the borders. They ended any kind of aid going in and out of the region. They shut down the internet, banking, cellular service, and particularly medicine crossing the border. And then a full front entered Tigray, whether it was Eritrean troops from the north or from the west, that little bit of border in Sudan. Amhara special forces from the Amhara state, which is just south and slightly west of Tigray, as well as Fano, which I spent some time with in the article, which is kind of a nationalistic or ethno-nationalist group that comes from the Amhara state. And these troops poured into Tigray, and we haven't really had a clear picture of what was taking place in Tigray, and we still don't. Even today, there are places that are inaccessible. There are rural areas without water, without electricity, without cell service. So here we are after a peace agreement last November. The war lasted with ups and downs that we can get into until last November, when two peace deals were signed, one in Pretoria and one in Nairobi. But still, these borders are difficult to cross, and we don't have a full picture of what took place in Tigray during the war.
The opportunity for Abiy to make peace with Eritrea by basically saying, like, we have a shared enemy, so maybe we should be maybe we can deal with this. The Tigrayans as that shared enemy, that dynamic shifted because the Tigrayans as I guess what would we call it, an ethnicity in Ethiopia had been essentially ruling the country or rulers of the country for what was it, 30 or 40 years?
27.
27. Yeah. And so the shift happened when the Amhara came back into power and then had the ability to basically say, like, our chief rivals are the Tigrayans. That's also the case with you, Eritrea. We can come together here.
Well, Abiy's a little confusing, right? He's only part Amhara, but he has used the tool of Amhara nationalism to support his endeavor. And the TPLF have an interesting history with Eritrea themselves. If you know that backstory, when Ethiopia was governed by the communist group, the Derg, from the fall of Haile Selassie, so the 70s, until roughly 91. The Derg were overthrown by a combination of Eritrean liberation groups led by Isaias Afwerki and liberation groups from Ethiopia, specifically Tigray, and that was Meles Zenawi. So these two were bosom buddies, and it's really only because of the coordination of both of them that they were able to overthrow the Derg in 1991. Eritrea got its independence. Ethiopia then was able to push toward modernization. They're the ones who set up kind of this ethno-nationalist federation of states. There are 11 states. And they established a constitution and did a lot to bring, services and infrastructure to Ethiopia. But they were also pretty strong-handed, and their rule was protested for many years.
I had visited Ethiopia back, I think it was in the late 90s. And I just remember having spoken to someone, I can't remember if it was maybe a taxi driver, who was talking about the Eritrean-Ethiopian war and saying it was like two bald men fighting over a comb. Like what are the combs even here? Like it's unclear to me. What are their resources? I mean, I understand the idea of like, I want power and the Tigrayans are a challenge to my power, but over what? Are there reasons? Is this a resource fight, or is it just simply, I mean, I'm just unclear on what is driving the motivations for these. Because it's, at one point, these two are allied, the Eritreans and the Tigrayans are allied, and then the Amhara and the Eritreans are allied against it just keeps shuffling around. It's unclear to me are there any sort of like, sort of static realities about resources that are involved here?
Absolutely. I mean, there's static resources, whether it's farming, whether it's water resources, power, guns, loyalties with other nations around the world. I mean, as we know, and really my interest in Ethiopia goes back to the 1960s, when my father was there, an American soldier who was on a base, classified still today, outside of Asmara, Eritrea. And it was really American influence that kept Eritrea under the imperial power of Ethiopia until 1991. Eritrea had been colonized by the Italians. They had a lot of incredible infrastructure and kind of this Western-facing identity. Not to say that racism wasn't a huge part of the colonial experience. But when the Americans and others pushed for Ethiopia to maintain control of Eritrea, it was so the Americans could keep this base. And the Eritreans were incredibly resentful. Ethiopia at the time was quite feudal, and Haile Selassie was an emperor. And so the independence movement rose up there. The power struggle was for independence, to make their own decisions. I could have asked you the same question maybe about Florida or Montana. Like, these are places, this is home of a population, quite ancient history, very beautiful tradition, and who makes their decisions for them, for these populations, means very much to them. Eritrea is a dictatorship, one of the most authoritarian countries, like I said, and it's a strange place to be. I went back in 2019, right after peace was made between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And Eritrea is a strange place today, one of the highest refugee populations because of mandatory conscription. In Ethiopia, Abiy wants power. I mean, Ethiopia has a fantastic economy. If you're talking about the continent, it's been one of the most stable countries in the Horn. And as you know, it's surrounded by a whole lot of trouble. Somalia is there, and in the news recently, Eritrea is building a huge dam. I have a second piece about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and the trouble that it's created with Sudan and farther upriver Egypt. I'm sorry, downriver Egypt. The Nile, of course, flows from the south to the north. So this is a strategic region. As I mentioned, the United States had this base in Eritrea for quite a while until the downfall of Haile Selassie in 74. But, Ethiopians were great allies to the United States when they were working on, that hideous war on terror, fighting al-Shabaab, other ways that the United States has partnered. Nick Turse has done a lot of great reporting about how the NSA built a surveillance network in Ethiopia. So strategically and for other reasons, not just our own interests, but on the ground, there are interests that mean very much to individuals there. And one is, coming democracy.
Right. So let's talk about what you found in terms of the evidence of what appears to be both sides committing atrocities against civilians.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that the concentration of atrocities and atrocities to list it is these incredible mass killings, systematic rape, use of food as a weapon of war, use of medicine, lack of medicine as a weapon of war, use of social media, internet access. But yes, the concentration was in Tigray. We still don't know because Tigray is still blacked out for us. But when the TPLF left the borders of Tigray and started to move south, they moved very quickly. They were moving toward Addis Ababa, and I had a visa. I was waiting to go to Ethiopia, and the State Department was sending me probably 3 emails a day saying, do not go to Ethiopia because we will not be able to get you out.
Wow.
I know. Whoever thought that Addis would be threatened, and yet it was. And they got as far south as maybe 200 kilometers from Addis Ababa, and then were pushed back. Their supply lines were too thin, and they just didn't have the resources. And Lalibela was one of the cities. It's a city in the Amhara state, a very holy city. Churches carved out of solid rock. I don't know if you got there to see them when you were in Ethiopia. But Lalibela had been held by the TPLF for 5 months. And it seemed an interesting place to go to talk to people who could tell me what the war had been like. And so that's where I start at the beginning of the piece, where I'm in Lalibela, and I happen to come across a Fano training, again, this Amhara militia that has been allying with federal troops, Amhara security forces, and Eritrean troops, and are accused of some of the most horrifying atrocities in Tigray.
What is the involvement of parties outside of Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Tigray? I mean, has there been where are all the weapons coming from? And I mean, I assume a healthy amount coming from the United States. But where is the rest of the world in terms of this conflict?
It's hard to understand. Tigray has been quite secretive and also quite cut off. The Western Tigray territory is still in contention, and that's really Tigray's only route through Sudan. So they've had, Sudanese allies and others. They've also had Oromo allies. Oromo is the largest ethnic group in the country. And the federal forces, of course, Abiy's been getting weapons from anyone he can, whether it's Turkey or the UAE. Isaias Afwerki is kind of a mystery. He's not one to give press releases on where he's getting his weapons, but he seems like he's got a good cache. He's been sitting on them for a while. So there are a number of countries in that area, particularly Middle East and other Horn nations, who have played allies, but they've played them rather loose in all of this. I think the hope is that Ethiopia remains strong, and it seems as though loyalty will go to the one who looks like he's the winner.
What would be the interests of outside groups? I guess just that Ethiopia maintains its strength, and that the U.S. still has its sort of resources there, I guess, or in terms of like a base, or just sort of, it's so unclear to me what the agendas are.
Well, I just read a piece this morning in Financial Times about the role that Russia is playing in seeking satellites there. So they're using Wagner Group and other resources to build loyalties across the Sahel. They're I forget what they're calling it. It was a kind of a fancy term, but Russia is working very hard. It's kind of like a post-colonial era where in my father's time, he was in the Horn of Africa trying to secure allies for the United States. It's kind of a proxy Cold War was building from the 1960s forward. And I think we're seeing a period of time as well where China is sinking tons of money into the continent, and Russia has its own power plays as well. And, neither of those nations asked for humanitarian governance when they offer financing or weapons or security forces, where the United States does. And it depends on what fight you want to discuss. Is it, spreading democracy, which is kind of a flaccid term at the moment? Like, of course, we don't want to see these kinds of atrocities taking place. Or is it influence? When you look at the UN vote on Ukraine and Russia, should Russia be sanctioned? Look at the number of African countries that were quiet and said that it shouldn't.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Lastly, how is it that they managed to have, how do you shut down the entire country and have so little information come out? I mean, it just seems. Is there, outside of the States, how have they been so successful in keeping this information sort of a bottlenecked?
Yeah, misinformation, disinformation, all of that has been incredibly helpful. The borders have been impassable. Aid groups have not been allowed in. Like I said, even today, last week, a bunch of journalists in Somali state of Ethiopia were incarcerated. So I think the government is really scary. They're unscrupuled and they're willing to silence anyone they can. And they, when you turn off the internet, when you turn off cell service, right, you've got refugees coming out, but they're still afraid. And also, this is a part of the world where punishment of families of those who speak out is not unheard of. And so, we use a few pseudonyms in my piece. I spoke to a Tigrayan in Addis Ababa, who had been detained and incarcerated along with his wife for a period of time. The federal government was doing that during a part of the war as well. And fear. And as you've seen, so much misinformation, disinformation on the internet.
Well, Ann Neumann, the piece is Falling Like Leaves. It is in the February issue of Harper's magazine. We will put a link to it. I can't recommend it enough to people. If you have been in any way bewildered by this, by what's going on there, this is a great place to start to get your bearings, both in terms of context and in terms of what's going on. Thanks so much for your time today, and great job on this reporting.
Thank you so much, Sam. Take care.